In the heart of a city that never slept, Aurora James lived a life that others could only dream of. New York, the concrete jungle that thrived on ambition, success, and the illusion of perfection, was her kingdom. She had become the face of fashion, her name a brand in itself. At 29, she was the epitome of beauty, elegance, and grace, and she knew it. The world watched as she graced the covers of top magazines, strutted down catwalks with an air of regal confidence, and posed for the most exclusive designers in the industry. Every time her name was announced, there was a collective sigh of awe, as if the world itself bowed to her image. Aurora's beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was a carefully crafted masterpiece. A symphony of flawless features that she had sculpted over years of discipline and sacrifice. Her raven black hair, always styled to perfection, cascaded like a dark waterfall around her delicate shoulders. Her skin, soft and glowing, seemed untouched by time, as if the sun itself had chosen not to age her. Her deep green eyes, framed by thick lashes, gleamed with a mixture of cold intelligence and undeniable allure. Aurora knew that her face, her body, was her ticket to power, and she wielded that power with precision. Her days were a blur of photo shoots, runway shows, and interviews. She lived in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the kind of place that screamed success even when the doors were closed. The walls were adorned with minimalist art, the furniture sleek and modern, as if every piece of her life had been curated to perfection. Each morning, as she awoke to the quiet hum of the city below, she would look in the mirror and inspect herself. No imperfection was allowed. If a strand of hair fell out of place, it was quickly corrected. If a freckle dared to appear, she would cover it up with the slightest touch of makeup. But in the quiet moments, when the cameras were no longer flashing and the adoring public had moved on to the next trend, Aurora was alone. Alone with her thoughts. Alone with the growing anxiety that gnawed at her insides. The pressure to remain flawless, to remain perfect, was suffocating. She had sacrificed everything, friends, family, even her own happiness, for the pursuit of an ideal. She would see the other models, the ones who didn't make it as far, and the envy in their eyes would sting. They too wanted what she had. The beauty, the fame, the money. But none of them understood the price of this life. They didn't understand that perfection was not just an external standard, it was an obsession that could consume you from the inside out. At night, when the city lights blurred into a haze below her penthouse window, Aurora would sometimes hear a voice in her head, a quiet, whispering voice, that reminded her of the cost of beauty. "You have everything, but you will never be enough," it would say. At first she thought it was just the exhaustion from a long day, but over time it grew louder. The voice became a constant companion, reminding her of every small imperfection, every minor flaw in her life that she had carefully hidden from the world. Yet the next morning she would once again rise, pull on her designer clothes and step into the spotlight. She would smile as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't just spent another sleepless night staring at her reflection, wondering when the cracks in her flawless facade would begin to show. Aurora James was a star, brilliant and untouchable. But like all stars, she was slowly burning out, unaware that her obsession with perfection was pushing her closer and closer to the edge. And little did she know, the event that would change her life forever was hurtling toward her at the speed of destiny, ready to shatter the illusion she had so carefully built. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that blurred the skyline of New York and made everything feel distant, as if the city itself were suspended between two worlds. Aurora's driver had insisted she stay inside, but she was already late for a charity event she'd agreed to attend, and in her world, appearances mattered more than anything. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not tonight. Wrapped in a silk, midnight blue gown that clung to her form like a second skin, she stepped out of her penthouse and into the waiting car, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Her face was a mask of calm, a smile already fixed on her lips, ready for the flashes of cameras and the chorus of compliments that would greet her at the event. But the truth was, she wasn't looking forward to it. She wasn't looking forward to anything. Her mind kept returning to the mirror she'd stood before this morning, the one that had been her judge for so many years. Today she'd noticed something new, just the slightest hint of a wrinkle under her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a big deal. It was nothing really. But in the quietest moments, it felt like everything. It felt like the beginning of the end. The driver navigated the slick roads with skill, but Aurora wasn't paying attention to the world outside. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a reminder of an upcoming photo shoot, a client's request for an immediate response. Another wrinkle in her busy schedule. Another demand. She barely noticed the car skidding until it was too late. The tires, slick with rain, lost their grip on the road. Time slowed as the car veered to the side, its weight shifting dangerously before it slammed against the guardrail. The force of the impact jolted Aurora against her seatbelt, her body slammed forward, and then everything went black. When Aurora opened her eyes, the world was blurry. Her head throbbed with an intensity that felt as though her skull might crack open. The smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, and her surroundings were unfamiliar: sterile white walls, the soft beep of monitors, and the low murmur of voices just beyond the door. For a moment she wondered if she were still dreaming. Then the realization hit her. She was in a hospital. A soft voice cut through the fog in her mind. "Miss James, you're awake. You've been in an accident, but you're going to be fine." Aurora tried to move, but a sharp pain in her chest made her stop. She glanced around the room, her vision still fuzzy, until her gaze drifted toward the mirror that hung on the wall across from her bed. She hadn't seen it before. But then she saw it, the reflection that made her stomach drop. Her face was unrecognizable. Her skin, once smooth and flawless, was swollen and discolored, bruised and battered in a way that no amount of makeup could cover. The sleek contours of her cheekbones were distorted, and her once perfect lips were torn and stitched. The green eyes she had once considered her trademark were now bloodshot and unfocused, staring back at her with the kind of vacant horror she had only seen in others before. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She couldn't even comprehend what she was seeing. She reached up, her hands trembling, but when they touched her face she could feel the unfamiliar texture of bandages and raw, exposed skin. A wave of nausea hit her and she sank back against the pillow, eyes wide with shock. This wasn't a nightmare. This was her new reality. And in that moment, the cold, hard truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had lost everything. Her beauty. Her identity. The very thing that had made her who she was in the eyes of the world and in her own eyes. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, staring at the reflection that was once her face, but when the nurse came in, her words seemed distant, far removed from her own shattered mind. "You've been through a lot, Miss James. We'll do everything we can. You're not alone." But Aurora didn't hear her. She couldn't hear anything except the voice in her head, whispering the truth that she was too terrified to face. Who am I now? Aurora lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to silence the thoughts swirling in her mind. Days passed, marked only by the changing shadows across her room, and the monotony began to chip away at her sanity. She no longer looked toward the mirror, choosing instead to shut herself off from anything that reminded her of the outside world. Every visitor, every nurse, every kind word or look of pity only heightened her sense of emptiness. The world she had belonged to, the glamorous world of flashing cameras and admiration, felt like a lifetime away. She was alone, a stranger even to herself. Her phone lay on the bedside table, fully charged, untouched since her accident. Messages poured in from friends, colleagues, even fans who had heard about the accident through the relentless gossip columns. But each ping felt like a taunt, a reminder of who she used to be and who she could no longer pretend to be. The messages started with warm wishes, then turned to questions, curiosity masked as concern. She couldn't bear to answer them. In her mind, she could imagine their shocked expressions, their forced sympathy, their carefully measured words as they tried to act like her beauty was still there. One afternoon, the nurse who had cared for her since day one entered with a gentle smile. Her name was Eve, and Aurora had come to recognize her steady presence, though she resisted the nurse's attempts at conversation. But today, Eve seemed different, her gaze focused, assessing Aurora with an intensity that made her feel stripped of her last shred of armor. "Aurora, I know you're going through something unimaginable," Eve began, her voice steady but laced with warmth. "But isolation won't make it easier." Aurora's eyes flashed with irritation. "What would you know about it?" she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. "Do you even realize what this means for me? My face, my life, is ruined." Eve didn't flinch. She continued to meet Aurora's gaze, her expression unchanging. "I may not know what it's like to be famous, to have the world look at you a certain way. But I know what it's like to lose something you think defines you. And I know that hiding from it only makes it worse." Eve's words cut through the anger and fear that Aurora clung to. "What happened to you?" Aurora asked before she could stop herself. Eve hesitated, then pulled a chair close and sat down. "I was a dancer, a professional one. It was my life, my passion, until an accident shattered my leg. After the surgeries, I couldn't even walk without a limp. And dancing, well, that was out of the question. My world collapsed too." For the first time since the accident, Aurora felt something beyond anger or despair. She felt a pang of understanding, an unwanted connection. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I spent months feeling sorry for myself, angry at the world, blaming everyone and everything," Eve admitted, a bittersweet smile on her lips. "But eventually I realized that the only way forward was to rebuild. To find a new way to see myself, even if it meant letting go of what I'd known my entire life." Eve's story lingered in Aurora's mind long after she left the room. That night, Aurora picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the messages she had ignored. One message stood out from the rest, from a photographer she had worked with countless times. A terse, almost businesslike question: "Are you coming back?" Aurora's fingers hovered over the screen, the words blurring as she stared at them. "Are you coming back?" The question echoed in her mind. Coming back to what? To the world of fashion that worshipped beauty above all else? To the pressure and the expectations that had drained her for years? For the first time, she wondered if there was another answer. If there could be a path forward that didn't revolve around reclaiming her past but instead facing the future, whatever that might mean. As she lay in the dark, her mind wrestled with the weight of Eve's words, the depth of her own fears, and the quiet, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to exist outside the image she had once so carefully built. In the days that followed Eve's story, Aurora found herself drifting in and out of a foggy contemplation. The idea of rebuilding, as Eve had put it, gnawed at her. Aurora had spent her entire career chasing an ideal, one that the world had reinforced and she had internalized. She had believed that her face, her body, her perfection, was her identity. But now that belief was crumbling, leaving her with a terrifying void. Her reflection haunted her even without looking in the mirror. Her mind constantly conjured up her former self, the vision of who she was, taunting her, reminding her of all she had lost. And yet, somewhere beneath the anguish, a quiet question had taken root. Who could she be now? One morning, a physical therapist arrived, a cheerful woman named Grace, who greeted her with a smile so radiant it nearly startled Aurora. Grace wore a bright blue scarf and spoke in a voice that seemed to fill the sterile hospital room with a warmth that had long been missing. "Miss James, I am here to help you get back on your feet," she said with a certainty that made Aurora flinch. "But only if you're ready." Aurora stared at her, irritation rising in her chest. "I do not think you understand, Grace. Getting back on my feet won't change anything." Her voice held a bitterness she hadn't meant to reveal, and for a moment she regretted her honesty. But Grace's expression softened. "I think I do understand," Grace replied, unfazed. She pulled up a chair and sat across from Aurora, speaking quietly but firmly. "Healing isn't just physical. It's about choosing to face the parts of yourself that feel broken. And that's as much of a journey as any recovery." Aurora turned away, her eyes fixed on the rain-splattered window. "I spent my whole life building something that no longer exists," she muttered. "Who am I supposed to be now?" "That is for you to discover," Grace replied gently. "But hiding from the world won't help you find out." She extended a hand, encouraging Aurora to take a small step forward, one that felt as enormous as scaling a mountain. Hesitating, Aurora reached out, letting Grace help her from the bed. Her legs trembled under her weight, unsteady from weeks of disuse, but Grace held her firmly. For the first time, Aurora felt a strange sense of relief in her weakness. This was different. She was beginning again, not from a place of perfection but from vulnerability. Step by painful step, they crossed the room, Aurora leaning heavily on Grace. With each movement, a raw ache filled her limbs, but it was different from the pain she'd felt staring at her reflection. This pain was tangible, physical, a reminder of life she hadn't felt in weeks. It was a tiny victory, one that seemed almost laughable, but as Grace guided her back to the bed, Aurora realized that she hadn't thought of her appearance even once. Back in bed, her breath heavy, she glanced up at Grace, feeling the slightest spark of something she couldn't name. "Thank you," she whispered, almost embarrassed by the words. Grace smiled, her voice soothing yet firm. "Tomorrow we'll do a bit more. And every day after that. Soon you'll realize you're stronger than you know." That night, as Aurora lay in the dark, her body sore but her mind restless, she reached for her phone. She hesitated, then opened a blank note. Tentatively, she began to write, the words spilling from her in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. She wrote about her fears, her anger, and the hollow ache that had defined her existence since the accident. But she also wrote about the sliver of hope she had felt while walking, guided by Grace's unwavering support. As she set the phone down, she realized something profound. She was beginning to find her voice again, even if it trembled. And in that voice, faint but steady, was the strength to take one more step toward the woman she might someday become. Aurora was beginning to settle into the silence. After days confined to her room, she had learned to shut out the sounds of the hospital. The beeping monitors, the footsteps echoing down the hall, even the occasional murmurs of the nurses. She was alone in her pain and her sorrow. Each passing day, she grew more comfortable with the isolation, letting it wrap around her like a familiar blanket. But the stillness was punctured when Grace entered with a surprising proposition. "Miss James," Grace began with her usual cheer, but there was something different in her tone. "There's a young group here at the hospital, a support circle really. Some of them are burn survivors, others have been through reconstructive surgeries, and they meet twice a week to talk. They would love for you to join them." Aurora looked up, momentarily shocked. "I don't think so," she replied quickly, shaking her head. She couldn't imagine herself sitting among others, exposing her broken self, let alone her emotions. She could barely acknowledge her own reflection, let alone face the empathetic eyes of strangers. Grace took a step closer, undeterred. "I think it could help, Aurora. Sharing can lift a burden, even one as heavy as yours. And who knows, maybe hearing their stories could give you perspective on your own." Aurora bit her lip, anxiety tightening her chest. But a part of her was curious, wondering about these people who had suffered in ways she had once thought unimaginable. The next afternoon, despite the nervous clenching in her stomach, Aurora allowed Grace to wheel her down a few floors to a small, nondescript meeting room. Inside, a circle of chairs was arranged, each one occupied by someone whose life, in one way or another, had been changed forever. There was a teenage boy with bandages around his arms, an elderly woman with burn scars across her hands, and a young man who wore a hat low over his face. Aurora felt every eye on her as she entered, her heart pounding as Grace left her at the door. She took a shaky breath and found a seat at the edge of the circle, determined to say as little as possible. The group facilitator, a gentle woman with a soothing voice, welcomed her before turning to the group. "Let's continue where we left off last week. I think Ryan was about to share." Aurora watched as Ryan, the boy with bandaged arms, cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, but there was a strength in his words as he spoke about his accident, about the painful skin grafts and the fear he'd never be able to play guitar again. Listening to his story, Aurora felt something shift within her. His pain, his vulnerability, resonated with a part of her that she had tried to bury. For the first time, she saw that her suffering was not as singular as she had believed. These people around her were not just wounds and scars. They were stories, lives marked by hardship and courage. When it came time for her to speak, Aurora hesitated. Her gaze fell to her hands, the remnants of her former self hiding behind the gauze and bruises. She took a shaky breath, and in a voice that surprised her, she began to speak. I am a model. Or I was until this." She gestured vaguely to her face, her cheeks flushing. "I've lived my entire life in front of a camera, my appearance was everything. And now it's gone." She paused, feeling the weight of her words, her admission ringing hollow in the room. But as she looked around, she noticed the nods, the expressions of quiet understanding. They didn't pity her, they understood her. The young man in the hat lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of empathy. The teenage boy, Ryan, gave her a small, reassuring smile. In that moment, a strange comfort began to settle over Aurora. Here, among people who had known true pain, her scars didn't seem as unbearable, her struggle not as isolating. These were people who had also been torn down and were now, somehow, piecing themselves back together. As the meeting concluded, the facilitator approached her with a warm smile. "Thank you for joining us, Aurora. I hope you'll come again." Aurora found herself nodding. I think I will." That night, back in her hospital room, she felt lighter, as if some of the weight she'd carried alone had finally been shared. For the first time since her accident, she felt the faintest glimmer of strength within herself, the beginnings of a bridge connecting her fractured identity to something whole again. She lay back, her thoughts drifting to the faces she'd met today, and felt a spark of hope. Perhaps healing didn't have to mean reclaiming what was lost. Perhaps it could mean building something new. Aurora returned to the support group the next week and the week after that. Each time, her resolve grew stronger, and the ache of her loneliness lessened. She listened, she shared, and slowly she began to feel a kinship with these people. People who had lost parts of themselves and were piecing them back together, in ways as unique as the scars they bore. One morning, after a session, the group facilitator approached her with an unexpected suggestion. "We have an art room in the hospital, a place where patients can express what they're going through. Some of us use painting, others writing. I think it could be good for you, Aurora." Aurora almost laughed. An artist? She'd spent her career in front of the camera, molded and framed by others, never thinking about creating anything herself. But that evening as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the idea. She remembered Ryan, the young guitarist in the support group, sharing how he'd started playing a single chord each day, reclaiming his art little by little despite his injuries. The next day she found herself standing in front of the art room, her hand resting on the door, hesitation prickling her nerves. After a moment she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a quiet, airy space with large windows that allowed streams of light to pour in. Canvases leaned against the walls, some half-finished, others splashed with wild colors and shapes. Aurora felt a strange pull toward the materials spread across a long table: paints, brushes, pastels, charcoal. She hadn't touched anything like this since childhood, yet now they seemed to beckon her. Slowly she picked up a brush and dipped it into a dark blue paint, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed it to the canvas. At first she hesitated, unsure of what to do or where to begin. But as the color spread across the white surface, something inside her unlocked. She brushed and smeared, adding layer after layer, letting her emotions spill out in each stroke. She didn't try to paint something beautiful. Instead, she let herself create something honest. Hours passed as she poured her anger, her fear, and her sadness into the canvas, using dark, raw colors that reflected the storm brewing inside her. There was no image, no design, just a chaotic expression of what she couldn't put into words. When she finally stepped back, her body was exhausted, her mind strangely calm. As she observed her work, Aurora felt a flicker of pride. This chaotic, abstract mess was hers. It wasn't beautiful in the way she once had been. It didn't have the symmetry or perfection that had defined her career. But it was real, an extension of herself that wasn't wrapped in pretense or expectation. For the next few days she returned to the art room, each time allowing herself to explore without restraint. She tried charcoal, creating jagged lines that echoed her pain. She used pastels, softer colors that brought out her gentler feelings, the slivers of hope she was rediscovering. With each new piece, she felt herself reclaiming parts of her identity that had long been overshadowed by her career. One afternoon, as she finished a piece, Grace walked in and gasped softly. "Aurora, these are incredible," she murmured, admiration bright in her eyes. "You have talent, real talent." Aurora felt a warmth rise in her chest, a validation different from the superficial compliments she'd once received. This wasn't about beauty or perfection. It was about expression, raw and unfiltered. That night, for the first time since her accident, she felt a glimmer of excitement about the future. She had lost one life, yes. But perhaps, through art, she was on the verge of creating another. A life shaped by truth, resilience, and her own terms. In the weeks that followed, Aurora's days found new rhythm and purpose. The hospital staff began to recognize her, not as the fallen supermodel, but as the quiet woman who spent hours in the art room, covered in smudges of paint, charcoal dust clinging to her hands. Her work became her voice, each piece an unspoken conversation with herself, a dialogue she hadn't known she needed. And as she created, something shifted in her. She was starting to accept the face in the mirror, the woman beneath the bruises and scars. One afternoon, as she finished a particularly vibrant painting, Grace entered the art room, carrying an envelope. "Aurora," she said, her tone both excited and tentative, "there's someone here to see you." Aurora's heart skipped, her mind racing through possibilities. She hadn't allowed herself to think of the world outside these walls, to consider the people who might remember her. The idea of visitors, of friends or colleagues from her old life seeing her like this, made her stomach churn. But when she looked at Grace, she saw only encouragement. Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace handed her the envelope. "It's from Elle magazine. The editor, Diana Hall, wants to see you. She's in the lobby." Aurora's hands trembled as she opened the letter, scanning the carefully penned words. Diana had been her friend and confidant for years, a powerful woman who had shaped Aurora's career in ways few others had. Her message was simple: "I heard what happened. I'd love to see you if you're ready." Aurora closed her eyes, a wave of emotions washing over her. She had avoided facing anyone from her former life, afraid of their reactions, of the pity in their eyes. But Diana had always been different, one of the few people who had ever treated her as more than just a pretty face. With a deep breath, she rose, brushing paint from her hands as best as she could, though faint streaks remained on her fingers. Grace offered her a reassuring smile, walking with her down the hallway until they reached the lobby. There, sitting on a plush hospital sofa, was Diana, graceful, poised, her expression warm and understanding. When she saw Aurora, her eyes softened, but not a hint of pity crossed her face. Instead, she rose and walked over, enveloping Aurora in a gentle hug. "I'm so happy to see you," Diana said, her voice a quiet reassurance. You look like Aurora." The word struck Aurora like a jolt. She had expected a comment on her scars, her changed appearance, but instead, Diana had seen her. The person she was, not the face she once wore. "Thank you," Aurora whispered, a faint smile breaking through her tension. They sat down together, and Diana took her hands, her eyes flickering to the paint-stained fingertips. "I've heard about your art," Diana said. "And if you're open to it, I'd like to showcase some of your pieces in L." Aurora's breath caught. The thought of her artwork being seen by others, by a world that once viewed her only through the lens of perfection, was both thrilling and terrifying. You really think people would want to see this?" she asked, gesturing to her hands. Diana nodded, her expression unwavering. "I do. The world has already seen the beautiful, untouchable Aurora James. Maybe it's time they see the real Aurora James. Art isn't about perfection, it's about connection. And what you're creating now has depth, honesty, things that resonate far more than any flawless face ever could." For the first time, Aurora felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond her old life, beyond the narrow expectations she had once clung to. She nodded slowly, feeling a new kind of strength blooming inside her. "All right," she replied, her voice steady. "Let's show them." As Diana left, Aurora lingered in the lobby, the possibilities unfolding in her mind. She had been afraid of the world's gaze, but perhaps now she could face it on her terms, not as a supermodel, not as a flawless image, but as the artist, as Aurora James, imperfect and whole. The days after Diana's visit were a whirlwind of preparation. Aurora had agreed to showcase her art, and Elle magazine's gallery team worked swiftly to organize a small exhibition in one of the city's most intimate art spaces. It would be a quiet affair, an exclusive invitation-only event for a select group of friends, artists, and media representatives. Despite her initial nerves, Aurora found herself drawn to the idea, excited in a way she hadn't felt in years. This was a different kind of unveiling. Her works, painted in those long, quiet hours in the hospital, held fragments of her journey, the raw, honest pieces of herself she had never shown to the world. These were her fears, her struggles, her rediscovery of what it meant to exist beyond beauty. And now she was ready to share them, scars and all. On the evening of the event, Grace arrived to accompany her to the gallery. She'd helped Aurora choose a simple dress, one that didn't demand attention but allowed Aurora's natural presence to shine through. Her hair was left loose, framing her face softly, and for the first time, Aurora chose not to hide the faint scars that remained on her cheeks. She wasn't trying to recreate her former self, she was ready to present the person she had become. As they arrived at the gallery, Aurora's heart beat fast, the quiet murmurs from inside heightening her anticipation. Diana greeted her at the door, her eyes warm and encouraging as she led her into the softly lit room, where her paintings lined the walls. Aurora scanned the faces of the guests, recognizing old friends and familiar figures from her past life. But no one stared. No one whispered. Instead, there was a quiet respect in their eyes, a recognition of something greater than appearance. Diana took a microphone, gesturing for the crowd's attention. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," she began. "This exhibition, titled The Fragments of Becoming, showcases the work of an artist who has not only captured beauty but has redefined it. Aurora James has brought us something raw and real, a glimpse into resilience and self-discovery. Tonight, she shares with us not just her art, but a piece of herself." Aurora felt her breath catch as Diana handed her the microphone. She hadn't prepared a speech, unsure until this moment if she would even speak at all. But standing there, in front of those who had once admired her for her looks alone, she felt a quiet power rising within her. "I spent my whole life believing that beauty was my worth," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But beauty is so much more than what we see in a mirror. It's the way we transform, the courage it takes to face our broken pieces and rebuild them. These paintings are parts of me, pieces of who I am becoming beyond what I once thought defined me." The room was silent, each face turned toward her with a mixture of admiration and respect. She could feel the acceptance in the room, the acknowledgement of her journey. For the first time, she was not defined by her face, her past, or her perfection. She was simply Aurora. As she stepped away from the microphone, her eyes met Sophie's, the young woman she had met in the hospital support group, who had come to support her. Sophie's face held a smile, full of pride and understanding, as though she too had come to see herself reflected in Aurora's art. Throughout the evening, Aurora moved through the gallery, speaking with guests who shared how her work had moved them. Each conversation left her feeling lighter, more grounded in the woman she was becoming. Her art wasn't just a personal outlet, it was a bridge between herself and others, allowing her to connect on a level she'd never known. As the night wound down, Aurora took a final look at her paintings. They were no longer just fragments of pain and recovery, they were symbols of a new identity. She wasn't just a supermodel, a face in magazines. She was an artist, a survivor, a person with depth that went beyond any image. As she left the gallery, walking into the night with Grace beside her, Aurora felt a rare and profound peace settle over her. She hadn't reclaimed her old life, but she had found something more, a purpose born of truth, vulnerability, and resilience. For the first time in her life she felt whole. In the days following the exhibition, the impact of Aurora's art rippled through circles she hadn't anticipated. The pieces from the Fragments of Becoming were covered in Elle, with Diana's heartfelt commentary on Aurora's transformation as both a model and an artist. Her story resonated with readers, sparking conversations online about beauty, resilience, and self-worth. Messages began pouring into her inbox, letters of encouragement, stories from others who had faced their own battles, and even a few who credited her art with inspiring them to confront their own insecurities. One afternoon, as she sat at home reading through the messages, she paused on one from a young woman named Emily, who shared how seeing Aurora's art had given her the strength to stop hiding her own scars. "For years I thought I had to look perfect to be seen as worthy," the message read. "But seeing your journey, Aurora, I realized my worth has nothing to do with how I look. Thank you for being brave." Aurora felt a warmth spreading through her chest. She hadn't anticipated this, hadn't expected her personal expression to resonate so deeply with strangers. The realization that her journey had touched others, helped them in ways she couldn't have foreseen, filled her with a sense of purpose that transcended her past life in the spotlight. Inspired, Aurora decided to take things further. She reached out to Diana, proposing an idea that had been taking shape in her mind since the exhibition. "I want to do something meaningful," she told Diana over the phone. "I want to create a platform, a space for others to share their stories through art. A place where we don't have to be perfect to be seen." Diana's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Aurora, that's exactly what the world needs right now. Let's make it happen." Within weeks, Aurora and Diana began work on a project they called Unveiled, an online platform dedicated to art, resilience, and self-expression. It was a digital gallery for people from all walks of life to share their stories, whether through paintings, photography, writing, or other creative outlets. They invited submissions from those who had faced physical or emotional challenges, those who felt overlooked by conventional standards of beauty, and anyone who wanted a space to express their true self. When Unveiled launched, the response was overwhelming. Submissions poured in, stories of trauma, healing, and transformation from people around the world. Artists shared pieces that reflected everything from chronic illness to mental health struggles, and each story echoed the same theme: resilience in the face of hardship, beauty in authenticity. Aurora spent hours each day reviewing submissions, moved to tears by the bravery displayed in each piece. Every story reminded her of her own journey, her own fractured yet beautiful path to self-acceptance. In curating these stories, she found herself healing further, her own scars feeling lighter as she connected with others on this shared path of growth. The platform grew quickly, gaining media attention, and soon, Unveiled became a thriving community. People engaged in discussions, encouraging and supporting each other in ways Aurora hadn't expected. For the first time, she felt she was using her influence for something lasting and meaningful. She was no longer just the woman who had once graced magazine covers. She was a voice, a mentor, and a guiding hand for those who needed to be reminded of their worth. One evening, as she reviewed a particularly moving submission from a young man who had survived a tragic accident, she felt a quiet pride settle within her. Her life had taken a direction she never could have foreseen, and she was no longer chasing fame or perfection. She was building something that mattered, something that would endure. Aurora looked at the scarred face that now felt like her own in the reflection of her laptop screen. She had transformed not just on the outside but deep within. In her vulnerability, she had found strength, and in her art, she had found purpose. And in helping others, she had finally found herself. As Unveiled gained momentum, Aurora was approached by an unlikely source, a well-known talk show host who wanted her to appear on a primetime segment about resilience and transformation. The offer stirred a mix of excitement and fear within her. For years, she had graced the media under the lights of glamour and perfection. This time, however, the spotlight would focus on a very different version of her, one that bore scars both visible and invisible. Diana was thrilled about the opportunity and encouraged Aurora to take the invitation. "This is your chance to show the world the power of your journey, Aurora," she said. "It's time they see all of you." After a moment's hesitation, Aurora agreed. She realized that appearing on the show was about more than just promoting Unveiled. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that beauty could coexist with imperfection, that her scars did not define her but rather highlighted her strength. The day of the interview arrived, and as she prepared, Aurora took a moment to examine her reflection. Her skin had healed considerably, though faint scars remained, reminders of the accident and everything that had changed since. She chose not to cover them, letting them show alongside a quiet confidence that had replaced her former need for approval. Walking into the studio, she felt an eerie familiarity. The bustling crew, the glow of the stage lights, the anticipation humming in the air, it was a world she had once belonged to. But this time, she walked with a purpose beyond her own image, a message of resilience she was eager to share. When the host greeted her on stage, the conversation quickly turned to her accident and the journey that followed. She spoke candidly about her struggles, the support group that had saved her from isolation, and the art that had brought her back to herself. Each word felt like an affirmation of her transformation, a declaration of the strength she had found in vulnerability. "What motivated you to create Unveiled?" the host asked, leaning forward, clearly captivated by her story. Aurora took a deep breath, her voice steady. "For most of my life, I believed beauty was my only worth. But after the accident, I learned that real beauty has nothing to do with perfection. It's found in the courage to face who we really are. Unveiled is a place where people can share that beauty, where our scars are not something to hide but something to embrace." The audience fell silent, hanging on to her every word. She could see people nodding, connecting with her story, as if each of them carried their own unseen scars. This was a different kind of spotlight, one that felt warm rather than harsh, illuminating her truth rather than concealing it. The host smiled. "Aurora, you've shown us that beauty is so much more than skin deep. Thank you for sharing your journey and for creating a space where others can do the same." As the show ended, Aurora felt a wave of relief and pride. The applause echoed in her ears, a validation that felt far more fulfilling than any applause she'd received on a runway. She had not only reclaimed her place in the world, but she had redefined it on her own terms. After the show aired, the response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from viewers inspired by her journey, and Unveiled saw an influx of new members, each person eager to share their stories, their truths. Aurora had expected support, but the depth of people's responses, sharing their own stories of resilience, their own scars, touched her in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she read the messages late into the night, she realized she had achieved something more meaningful than she ever could have imagined. Her story had become a beacon, one that allowed others to find strength in their own imperfections. In opening herself up to the world, she had inspired others to do the same. And in that mutual vulnerability, Aurora had finally found her purpose. A few weeks after her appearance on the talk show, Aurora received an invitation that left her speechless. It came in the form of an elegant white envelope embossed with gold, addressed to her by a renowned global fashion house. The message inside was brief but profound. They wanted her to walk in their upcoming show, not as the flawless supermodel she once was, but as the Aurora James who had redefined beauty through resilience. They were planning an event that celebrated unconventional beauty and stories of transformation, and they wanted her to be a central part of it. Aurora's first reaction was disbelief. She hadn't set foot on a runway since the accident, and the thought of returning filled her with a complex mix of excitement and fear. But beneath the initial shock, she felt a growing sense of purpose. This was her chance to walk the runway as herself, not as an image of perfection but as a symbol of survival, strength, and authenticity. She reached out to Diana for advice, her voice laced with hesitation. "Do you think this is a good idea? I'm not the same person I used to be. I'm not flawless." Diana's reply was immediate, her tone warm and confident. "Aurora, this invitation isn't about perfection. It's about showing the world what true beauty looks like. You've spent so long hiding your strength in the shadows of your scars. Now is the time to step into the light, to show that beauty has depth, resilience, and power beyond the surface." Aurora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Diana's words settle over her. This was not about reclaiming her old life. It was about embracing her new one, scars and all. With a newfound resolve, she accepted the invitation, knowing that this would be more than just a return to the runway, it would be a public affirmation of her transformation. In the weeks leading up to the show, Aurora spent hours preparing, not just physically but mentally. She trained, pushing her body back into the rhythm of walking with confidence and strength. The fashion house provided a team to help her craft a look that celebrated both her past and her present. A sophisticated, understated ensemble that emphasized her natural beauty and allowed her scars to be visible yet gracefully embraced. On the night of the show, the venue buzzed with anticipation. The world's most influential figures in fashion, media, and art gathered, their eyes on the runway, awaiting the lineup that promised to challenge conventional beauty. Backstage, Aurora felt a wave of calm wash over her, a surprising peace she hadn't felt in years. She was about to step into the world again, but this time as her truest self. When it was her turn, she walked onto the runway, her head held high, her steps steady. The crowd's reaction was immediate. A hush fell over the room as they took in the vision of Aurora James, not as the flawless model she had once been, but as the woman who had embraced her imperfections. She moved with a grace and confidence that didn't demand approval but invited connection. With each step, she felt the weight of her journey, the pain, the healing, the acceptance, all merging into a profound sense of freedom. Her scars, once hidden, now felt like badges of strength, and the audience responded with awe, respect, and admiration. Aurora's gaze swept the crowd, taking in their expressions, and in that moment she knew she had broken through something larger than her own fears. She had redefined beauty on her own terms, sending a message that echoed far beyond the walls of that venue. As she reached the end of the runway, she allowed herself a small smile, her heart swelling with pride. The applause was thunderous, filling the room with a powerful affirmation of her journey. For Aurora, this wasn't just a return to the runway, it was a celebration of survival, of choosing to live fully, even when life had taken her down unexpected paths. Walking backstage, she was met with tearful smiles, embraces, and congratulations from fellow models and the show's creators. They saw her not only as a pioneer but as a beacon of hope and authenticity. That night, as she left the venue, Aurora looked up at the city lights, her heart light. She had reclaimed her place in the world, not as the Aurora she once was, but as the woman she had fought to become. She was free, whole, and ready for whatever lay ahead. After the fashion show, Aurora's life transformed in ways she hadn't expected. She became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that beauty could withstand hardship, adapt, and emerge even more profound. The media buzzed with her story, but this time they focused not on her image but on her strength and the authenticity she brought to her art and her new platform, Unveiled. Her journey resonated with people from all walks of life, and her inbox overflowed with messages from those touched by her story. She took every opportunity to speak out about the transformative power of embracing oneself, imperfections and all. She accepted invitations to speak at schools, support groups, and art events, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to find beauty in their own scars. Every story she heard, every face she met, deepened her commitment to this new purpose. She was no longer just a former model. She was a voice, a guiding light for those struggling to find their worth beyond appearances. One evening, as she sat in her quiet apartment overlooking the city, she looked around at the paintings she had created during her time in the hospital. Each piece told a part of her story, a tapestry of pain, acceptance, growth, and ultimately strength. She realized that each stroke, each color, was a reflection of her journey from a woman defined by beauty to a woman defined by courage and self-acceptance. Reflecting on how far she had come, Aurora felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The accident, which had once seemed like the end, had instead been the beginning of a deeper life, one in which she connected with others in ways she hadn't known were possible. She knew she could continue modeling and speaking, but now her purpose was broader than she could have ever dreamed. Aurora decided to record a final message for her followers on Unveiled. She sat in front of the camera, the lights soft, her face unfiltered and free of makeup. Her scars were visible, but so was the quiet confidence in her eyes. "Hello everyone," she began, her voice calm and steady. "Many of you know me as someone who used to be defined by beauty standards, someone who spent years in front of cameras chasing a perfect image. But life had different plans for me. What seemed like the end was really just a new beginning, one that has shown me the strength I didn't know I had." She paused, her gaze meeting the camera. "I used to believe beauty was only skin deep. But now I understand that true beauty is found in resilience, in authenticity, in the courage to face ourselves and embrace every part of our journey, even the painful parts. Unveiled has given me a chance to hear so many of your stories, to connect with you on a level that goes beyond what we see in the mirror. I want you to know that your scars, your struggles, they don't diminish you, they make you whole. With a gentle smile, she concluded, "Thank you for being part of this journey with me. I hope my story reminds you to find strength in your own. And if you've connected with anything I've shared, please subscribe and join our growing community. Together, let's continue to redefine beauty, one story at a time." As she ended the recording and uploaded the video, Aurora felt a sense of peace settle over her. She no longer feared the spotlight, she welcomed it, knowing that it illuminated something far more meaningful than a flawless image. It shone on a community of people embracing themselves, scars and all, and finding power in that shared humanity. Her phone buzzed with notifications, each one a connection, a shared experience, a note of gratitude. And as she watched messages from around the world pour in, she knew that her story, her resilience, was making an impact. Aurora had found her voice, her purpose, and in sharing it, she was helping others find theirs.